from a course developed for professionals, and those professionals are the National Consortium of Interpreter Educators Centers, NCIEC. The next slide, please. NCIEC includes these 5 regions that you see in this slide, these 5 regional centers, and 1 national center. Next slide, please. The purpose of this national consortium is to increase the number and quality of interpreters nationwide. The way that we go about making this take place is to work together with different groups, interpreter education programs, interpreter educators, and interpreters themselves, the consumers, and government agencies. You could have a court agency or a commission for the deaf in various states that also work together with us in the consortium. We provide technical assistance, educational programs, training, outreach, research, and many other diverse services. Some of our projects include all the regional centers and the national center. This set of seminars incorporates all these centers working together. The Marie Center has developed 5 courses that can be reached online that then carry on an in-depth discussion about the topic of interpreting in voc rehab situations. If you would like further information, we encourage you to go to the Marie website and get the further information that's available to you there. Next slide, please. There should be one more. Great. Thank you. The goal for this webinar this evening is to describe VR's consumers. What do we typically see as VR clients? We want to explain also the federal requirements for eligibility, allowing us to provide services to those involved with VR. We want to describe the VR process. We want to talk about the unique terminology that is used by vocational rehabilitation. Next slide, please. So, I would like to have you all who are involved with this webinar to go ahead and vote. If you are currently working with VR consumers, please raise your hand by indicating on that column on the right, the control panel. There are some dots, some buttons, icons, and when you look at the 4th one, click on that. that'll indicate that you've raised your hand. Okay? So please go ahead and indicate that if you have worked with both rehab consumers, if you're working with them right now. So see the voting coming in. I'll let you know the totals once we get there. Okay, we need to hurry because the time for the voting process is going to close soon. It seems that most of the participants have voted, and the numbers indicate that 43% of all of you participating do currently work with VR consumers. I know that some of you may have done this in the past, working with VR consumers. Some may do it in the future. Regardless, whether it's been something you've done in the past, are doing now, or in the future, you will benefit from this discussion this evening. Next slide, please. Thank you. VR consumers who are deaf are an extremely diverse group. You cannot just all label them as one particular group. That would not be a possibility. In a little while, we'll discuss the federal requirements for becoming eligible for both rehab services. But for right now, the most critical thing I would like to emphasize is all the differing types of deaf people that we do provide services for through Voc Rehab. Some of our consumers are deaf without any additional disabilities. Some are hard of hearing. Some are deaf with a cochlear implant. Perhaps others have been born in other countries and have immigrated to the United States. So we serve a wide range of consumers. Next slide, please. We also have many VR consumers who are deaf plus. That means they may have other disabilities. They could be blind or have cerebral palsy, some other physical disabilities. There are others who might have other cognitive issues or mental health concerns. So those are the variety of needs that require different approaches by Voc Rehab in working to meet the needs of these consumers. Next slide, please. We'd like to talk a little bit about some labels. Just a moment ago, I used the term Deaf Plus. That is a term that's beginning to spread more. It's used to describe people who are deaf, but in addition have other things that are challenges or issues that will impact language expression or comprehension. We have another term that's used is disfluent. That means they're not fluent in their use of sign language. Perhaps they grew up without any exposure to the use of sign language. So there's some who have no language, or perhaps you're serving persons who are immigrants from other countries. They may have that fluency in their own home sign language, but do not have that fluency in American Sign Language. So that's what we call disfluent. Next slide, please. I'm sorry, could you go back one slide, please? Yes, thank you. This is another term that can be somewhat sticky. In voc rehab historically, I'd say since the 1960s and 70s, this was a term that was used quite often in research and in print, and that is low functioning deaf people, and that was abbreviated as LFD. When you look through the lists, it incorporates many of the different variety of characteristics. And if you think about the discussion about deaf plus and then disfluent, those two terms incorporate what used to be under the definition of low functioning deaf. I feel it's important, though, to still retain the knowledge of low functioning deaf because that term is used quite frequently in publications, and many people's needs and challenges are discussed in that content, and it's quite worthwhile. So we don't want to discard all of that research, but at the same time we're trying to recognize the fact that in the year 2014 that term is really not the most appropriate. I want to mention one particular publication from 1999. It was published by the 25th Institute of Rehabilitation Resources Issues. And that publication is over 100 pages, has a great deal of information included in that. I will send that connection to you once the webinar is completed for your perusal. The point is the label is not as important as the fact that we are providing these people with VR services. These services are provided to help them attain their various goals, taking into consideration their backgrounds and challenges and how we will meet those. So next slide, please. I don't want to go in great depth with this. I'm sure you're already aware of many of the different types of variations there are in language. My point here is that voc rehab consumers, as they come to our offices, you might meet them having any one of these different variations. It's possible that a person may be fluent in another sign language and not yet fluent in American Sign Language, so that's not on this list. But that means that as interpreters, we need to be able to envision that possibility and be prepared for any of those situations arising when we go into the assignment. Remember that there are some deaf VR consumers who are hard of hearing, who still can speak, or late deafened consumers who are part of this list as well. Next slide. Okay, it's your turn again. I would like to know, I'm curious, if in your community you have a great number of deaf immigrants here in the United States. If you do have a large number, please raise your hand. And you also can type onto the right chat box what country some of these people have moved here from. For here where I live in Boston, Massachusetts, we have a great number of people from Brazil. and Haiti. Of course, we have a number of other countries that deaf persons have come from, but those were our predominant ones. I'm just curious to know what are some of the foreign language usages that other people are experiencing. So far I'm seeing 34% of you have a fairly large community, and I'm looking at the chat boxes to see what different countries are representative. I see Russia, Iran, Mexico, Kenya, Hmong. So you can see a wide range of other language used, and so that provides a great number of variables for us as interpreters that we need to keep in mind. Thank you. Next slide. Again, I don't want to go in great detail about this issue, but I just wanted to expose this point that what this does impact on voc rehab services. We have just a brief description of the typical educational settings where students may be placed. So we have clients who have gone through the residential schools for the deaf, and the experiences that they would have would vary greatly by those who were mainstream. Their worldviews would be very different. Those who have come from schools for the deaf have had the opportunity to experience being around deaf adults, deaf professionals, and having that socialization with them. Students who are mainstream may never have met a deaf professional, or maybe very rarely. So the worldview of these two different groups affects the way you look at their goals. And so it's something also to remember when you're working with these VR consumers. Next slide. Thank you. Of course, we all are familiar with the variety of approaches there are existing in deaf education. When young deaf children are categorized by their communication modes, like being trained orally, using manually coded English, cued speech, or American Sign Language, their environments, say if they're totally in an oral program or totally in an English-based program, it'll be very different. And upon graduation from their programs, they come to us at VR. But you'll be exposed to them having a great number of different experiences. So again, we need to be prepared for the fact that we need to meet the needs, the communication needs of these variety of groups. Next slide, please. Okay, your turn again. If your community has a residential school for the deaf that has dorms, or a day program for the deaf, where it's a totally deaf school, please raise your hand. And if you want, you can also type in the names of your schools, the residential schools or these day programs. It'd be nice to know where these different programs are. I see MSSD, Michigan School for the Deaf, Hawaii School for the Deaf. Whew, they're coming in fast and furious, but you can look at the list in your chat box. So you see we do have a national audience here today. That's really wonderful. So we see in the voting, 46% of you have regular residential schools or day school programs in your communities. I think that's very good. We're also concerned about residential schools closing, and so it's really nice to see that there are that many, that 40% of our audience still have strong programs locally. Thank you. Next slide, please. We have talked about when people approach us at Voc Rehab for services, we need to understand their backgrounds, what education and communication styles they have. Did they grow up in America, or have they moved here from another country? Perhaps they have other challenges, other disabilities, variety of communication needs. So now we want to talk about Voc Rehab's language, particular to us. You know, we have unique vocational rehabilitation consumers. We have unique language within Voc Rehab as well. Next slide. So, if currently or in the past you've worked in Voc Rehab situations, and when you've been interpreting, a term came up that was particular to Voc Rehab and you had no understanding of what precisely that meant, please raise your hand. Numbers are still coming. Again, if you want to type in the chat box any of those terms that you were unfamiliar with the first time you heard them, feel free. We see that 27% of you experienced a term while interpreting that you were unfamiliar with. Here are some examples: job readiness training, OOS, JRT, and I think Voc Rehab is very used to having many, many acronyms placed one right after the other, and you don't know what they mean, and that makes it difficult. One of the comments we've seen is that when there are a group of Voc Rehab counselors in a meeting and they're talking quickly in their jargon, it can become very difficult to follow for the interpreter. Other items were like ticket to work, O&M, supportive employment. And typically what we have done is, as interpreters, we tend to learn those types of terms on the job while we're actually interpreting. We get our own OJT, so to speak, when we're there, because when we're not sure, we have to ask others what this term means, other counselors, and so on. And so we're always in a learning mode repeatedly. Next slide, please. I'm happy to inform you that our consortium has been working on providing outreach assistance for this Voc Rehab terminology. We have established a glossary of VR terms. One of our regional centers in the Northeast, at Northeast University, is working to bring all of those together for the consortium, and they have developed 100 terms in their glossary list. And They're probably the top 100 terms that you encounter frequently in VR situations. We collected those by contacting VR professionals and VR interpreters as to what were the most critical terms that people needed to know if they were on the assignment interpreting, and collected those. And both the VR professionals and the interpreters assisted us in providing written English descriptions of those terms. Then we hired a deaf translator to be able to then put that into American Sign Language. And I'll show you a little bit of that in the next slide, please. I know the picture is very small, but hopefully you'll get the idea. For each term, we have the description in English and also the ASL rendition provided by a deaf person. The glossary goes alphabetically from A to Z. Really W, there's no Z terminology. But regardless, we have those 100 glossary terms. Next slide, please. When you click on the picture, it will then provide the signed translation. We're not going to be able to show that to you tonight. I'm a little bit fearful of trying to show you any videos, but you get the idea of what this all looks like. The way that you can find the glossary will be shown to you here in a moment. Next slide. If you go to this consortium website, interpretereducation.org, and interpreter education is one word. When that screen comes up, you see the green toolbar, and you go specifically to the drop-down menu for specializations, and then you see there Voc Rehab. Click on that. It will then bring up, can you give me the next slide, please? It will show you these options. The third one is the one you would select, and that's indicating the consortium work and resources for interpreters, Voc Rehab interpreters. Click on that. That will then bring up, next slide please, the list of the variety of things that we've developed for interpreters working in Voc Rehab settings, including this glossary of terms. Now I want to let you know that the glossary is listed. You can look at it on the bottom.
It's located.
It's located at the bottom. You click there and it will bring up the glossary. I do encourage you to go to that site and see what are the things we have to offer. We have a wealth of printed materials and DVDs and a 6-pack of DVDs that you can order. Those will be completely focused on Voc Rehab situations. This information is available for any person, whether it's an instructor, an interpreter, mentor. You can use them in any way you feel would be valuable. That information is available to you. We will soon start talking about the rehab process, and D. Clanton will be joining us, and I wanted to pause for just a moment and see if there were any questions at this time regarding the consumers, terminology, the glossary, anything related to what's been discussed thus far. If you want to pose those right now, or if you'd rather wait until later, that's fine. But I thought I'd give you a moment to enter any questions in the chat box. And Carrie then would read them aloud, and the interpreter will assign those questions if there are any there, and I'll be happy to answer. So let's give them a moment. I'm not getting any, so that's good. So let's proceed. To introduce you, D. Clanton. He is a state coordinator for the deaf in New Hampshire. He's worked in voc rehab for many number of years. He's going to share with us his experience and wealth of knowledge. He'll be talking to you about the voc rehab process. D, the process starts with the application. If a deaf person gets in touch with vocational rehabilitation and wanting to apply for services, what is the first step in the process? What do they need to let VR know about opening an application?
Hi there, Trudy. I really enjoyed your portion of the presentation. In terms of the voc rehab procedure and what that looks like, exactly, when a consumer does make contact with voc rehab, we'll begin by asking them questions about what their interests are and what they'd like to achieve. We'll gather their medical information, their educational information and psychological assessments, any number of other documents. When they come to the VR office, if they have none of those documents to present to us, then VR can reach out and gather that information that's necessary. In terms of an audiogram or any number of documents, we can assist in gathering those. Next slide.
Yes, next slide. One more slide, please. Thank you. That's the correct slide. So, consumers, providers, or VR counselors will gather the necessary information, their medical, psychological, educational documents, have those available to then peruse and determine if that consumer has sufficient barriers to employment. It focuses on the work environment. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes. And it has to be determined based on criteria in the application whether a person is eligible or not. We have a number of items that go towards verifying that person's physical or mental impairment, as well as understanding what the person may benefit from receiving VR services and how that person may benefit. We gather medical information, educational information, psychological information, and all of that is very helpful in making that determination. And also, you mentioned Social Security. Obviously, that's another complicated system that comes into play, whether it's SSI or SSDI and a person relying on that. Voc Rehab will, however, provide assistance in providing benefits counseling to consumers, giving them more information on how those systems can work together. We believe in teamwork and working to help each other.
Next slide, please. We've spoken about the application process and the requirements for eligibility. I want to wait just a moment on speaking about order of selection, and we will speak about that and how that influences the determination of who can receive services from Voc Rehab. Dee, can you let us know a little bit about VR funding? Does it come from the federal government and the states? They both participate in that, is that right?
Yes. Yes, indeed. But that's not the case across the board. Generally speaking, it's joint funded through federal and state funding. In New Hampshire, however, we don't have state funding, only federal funding. But in most settings, yes, it's a joint funded program between federal and state funds. And when it comes to order of selection, I noticed that term come up. OOS is how it's referred to often. And in Washington, there's a federal law that establishes SRCs, or state rehab councils. It may be different. It may be called something different in different states, but it requires all Voc Rehab systems to have a council of external individuals in place. Maybe deaf individuals, blind individuals, consumers, legislators, former clients of Voc Rehab, independent living representatives, any number of representatives on the council. For example, we had a meeting with our SRC this afternoon. That was very rich. And the purpose of the SRC is to monitor the VR services in terms of budget, as well as policies and programmatic issues, and I know it can vary state to state how that takes place. But since VR is funded by both states and the federal government, like I said, some states differ in how it's funded. Some states have a richer funding from the state, others less so. But oftentimes that funding can be very limited, in which case we can't serve all of the individuals that would seek out services. So we create a list, a waiting list essentially. It may not be a best practice necessarily, but the order of selection is what's referred to as, and it allows Voc Rehab to stretch the funding that's made available and to focus on those with, quote unquote, the more severe disabilities. And in some states, that's defined as, a deaf person may be considered severely disabled. In some states it wouldn't be. To me, it would be, because oftentimes it comes down to a communication barrier to employment. Depends on, and sometimes a person is deaf with additional disabilities, and each state has a different view on what's considered severe disabilities. But the federal government wants the budget to be monitored by SRCs, and it can become very complicated from state to state. Some states will have a waiting list, an order of selection, and I know that isn't always beneficial. It might be 1 month to 6 months to a year that a person, or even 2 years, would wait on a waiting list. But if a person is deaf with additional disabilities, they would oftentimes rise to the top of that list. It varies, though, very much by individual. Was that a clear answer?
Oh, very clear, yes.
Okay.
I just wanted to have a few follow-up questions to clarify, but you're assigning it, and your presentation is extremely clear, so that's great. First, most but not all states do contribute monies to the Voc Rehab budget. All of the states do receive federal funds. Is that correct?
Correct.
And each state goes through an SRC, and the SRC looks at the budget and the number of people who are applying for services and make determinations whether there's sufficient funding to serve all the people who have requested service. If there is not sufficient funding, then OOS, order of selection, will come into play, which then emphasizes the most disabled people to receive services. And not all states have an OOS. I mean, New Hampshire does not presently, but other states do. So it depends on, for our audience, you need to find out what's happening in your state, the policy regarding order of selection, so that you'll be familiar with that. And some states call a person who is deaf truly disabled and doesn't have to be concerned with the order of selection. Other states do not see a person who is only deaf with no other disabilities as being that severely disabled, and then would be placed on the order of selection list. So it's a complex issue. There are a lot of variables from state to state. Yes, Dee.
And Trudy, I would add that when it comes to order of selection, that's voted on not only by the SRCs. Oftentimes, the SRC will make a determination, as we did this afternoon. We voted to not have an order of selection put in place. And we sent that to the rehab services in Washington, D.C., so that we could continue to monitor the services in our state. I've heard that there are a few states who have just removed their order of selection, and it will allow them to provide better and more efficient services to their consumers. It very much depends. But yes, Trudy, how you describe that is correct.
Okay, thank you, Dee. Next slide, please. So we're going back to the rehabilitation process, the procedures. A person applies, then a voc rehab counselor will see if they're eligible, and if then they become approved. The VR counselor then will sit and work with that particular individual to determine what their work interests are. Say a person coming already knows that they want to work in this specific area. Do we still require a full evaluation if the consumer already knows what they want, as compared to someone who comes in not knowing what it is they'd like to do as far as employment? So maybe you could explain more about that whole evaluation process.
Sure. And to step back, Trudy, you mentioned about deaf residential schools and students who have been mainstreamed. Oftentimes we see them approach this very differently. When it comes to evaluation, like you mentioned, Trudy, people from deaf residential schools may know what their interests are, and mainstream students may not know what they want to be as much. And so we'll provide different evaluations based upon those populations. But not only that, if a person were to have graduated high school and make contact with VR, very much ready to know what they'd like to do, another person may not. And so we have to evaluate them according to what their interests are. Perhaps they have applied to Gallaudet or another university. Maybe they've already been accepted, in which case we can just talk about what evaluations are needed then. If they come to voc rehab not knowing what they'd like to do, then we oftentimes provide on-the-job training. We find that to be very helpful, assisting them in understanding their strengths and weaknesses, what their interests are, and what they're not interested in. And maybe they're interested in working outside rather than inside an office, or vice versa. It can vary based on the individual, and those evaluations are very helpful in determining that. It also is helpful to assess what their interests are so that we can meet their needs as we move forward in the process.
Thank you. Next slide, please. this slide speaks to planning. It's my impression that that's really the true meat, the content of the whole voc rehab process. I mean, the consumers and the counselors get together and develop the individual plan for employment, the IPE. Perhaps you can go into more depth about the IPE itself. What
Sure.
all is included? Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Well, Trudy, the individual plan for employment, or IPE, is helpful in that it allows VR counselors and consumers to meet together and keep them on track with this plan, with the IEP. And every time they do meet, they'll base their discussions upon that IPE, making certain that they are in agreement of what it includes. And from time to time, they'll look and make sure that it's meeting the person's various needs before going back again to meet as counselor and consumer and determine whether those needs have been met or not that are included in the IPE. The IPE just helps keep the process on track, not having a person wait too long or be uncertain about what services are being provided, but it keeps the process on track. And that isn't always easy, but this can be a helpful tool.
Why not?
Well, sometimes, occasionally a consumer may be responsible or less responsible, and maybe a voc rehab counselor would say, have you done this or that? And they haven't. And the voc rehab counselor would have to somewhat get on them and say, you need to do these things and prove that they're abiding by the plan. We have it in black and white and allow something observable to track and sometimes push the consumer, not only deaf and hard of hearing consumers, but consumers in general. So that's one element in which that's helpful. When it comes to college students, if a person goes into, has college financial aid, for instance, oftentimes in many states, there are similar funding systems, but they vary from state to state. And voc rehab typically will check and see if there is financial aid or scholarships available for students, grant funding, be it federal or state, parent funding, perhaps there's family resources to provide. Then voc rehab will be the provider of last resort when it comes to financing college education, and that's been the case for some time. In some states, I don't know of any state that voc rehab entirely funds college educations. I think it's similar in most states. For example,
Dee, I'm sorry, I wanted to ask, I think some time ago, many deaf people thought that voc rehab will pay for all of their college expenses, because I wonder, is that true that that used to be the case, and now they're paying less of that? Is that what's happened?
Yeah, there have been some significant changes through time. When I was a voc rehab client, I didn't have any financial aid at the time. My family helped in some ways, but other students, a roommate of mine, all of them were fully funded by voc rehab. One was from Alabama, I recall. A number of them were from different states. And I thought, well, why couldn't my parents have saved that money? But it varied from state to state. And you're right, in the past, that was more so the case, that voc rehab would fund college educations more so. But that's changed. Typically, nowadays, there are priorities that a state, they'll try to go to the school in the state first as the first option and Gallaudet as a second option. In New Hampshire, oftentimes we'll have them seek out Gallaudet first and the state school second. We have some other state schools in New Hampshire that are second and third options. So we're somewhat different than the other states. It really depends on how that state operates. And,
Okay. I am aware that colleges do look at the financial needs before awarding any funds. VR services do not have entitlements, but the majority of voc rehab services will be covered, right? Like for training or
oh, yeah.
needing interpreters and things like that. So does that requiring funding you have to have assessments before you go to college?
When it comes to funding college, that's the case, but other than that, other needs, when it comes to training or providing interpreters, no, that's paid for in full without a financial assessment of need. It's just training or a certification program. Those are very different than colleges or universities. We'll pay for those services until a person becomes employed.
So what about hearing aids? Will those be covered?
It varies state to state when it comes to hearing aids. For example, consumers will come and say, I need a hearing aid, and we'll say, all right. And we look at their financial needs to see what they can afford. And in the state of New Hampshire, we go in half and half, or 50-50 for a hearing aid. And they'll be approved to receive half of the funding from Voc Rehab. If they can't afford any going towards the hearing aid, then we have a waiver that's put in place for their portion of it, and we'll pay the difference or what's left. But we do end up paying some amount for hearing aids. I know that there are some states who are working on changes to hearing aid policies, setting up business contracts for reduced charge for hearing aids. I don't know if any of them have gone through or not, but I've heard in my network that some states are working on reducing the costs of hearing aids to allow for better services to hard of hearing individuals.
Okay, let me just double check my notes here. I wanted you to clarify something. You had said in New Hampshire, your approach was that if a deaf person were to come to your office wanting to go to college, you would emphasize they're going to, say, Gallaudet or NTID or some other university that has services focused on deaf students as opposed to any other regular university. But in other states, they may emphasize that the students need to consider going to their state university first, and things like Gallaudet, places like Gallaudet and NTID would be like a second choice, but it varies by state. Is that right?
That's right. That's right. We refer to that as a best practice, what we do here in New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, we're very sensitive to the needs of deaf students here. And when it comes to, oftentimes they're isolated in mainstream settings, and they have potential, they have interests when it comes to their education, and we know that those will be met at Gallaudet or NTID, but oftentimes, based on what's around near their home, there may be something close, community college, that may serve their needs in some of the communities here. And in some states, though, that's not the case. Gallaudet and NTID do fall lower on the priority list, and the nearby community or state schools will be more higher on the list. But we do see more students being referred to Gallaudet and NTID, California State University at Northridge and Texas.
Right, right, SWID. Okay, that sounds good.
That's right, SWCID.
So next slide, please. So we've gone through the application process, the training and planning, and now we finally come near to the completion where we place a client in employment. So now we've gone through the entire process, they're ready. Voc Rehab will provide a variety of support once the person is placed in a job. We help them through the resume and interview process. Can you expand somewhat on when a deaf person is wanting to go into a place of employment, but the employer is very hesitant to hire a deaf person? They have no experience in working with deaf consumers. How is it that you go about convincing those employers to hire a deaf person?
Oh, I could talk about that all afternoon.
We only have 20 minutes left.
That's right, I know. That's oftentimes that companies are resistant, are resistant to hiring a deaf person, and I'll have a story for you. There was a deaf person who came for VR services who wanted to work at a casket company. And I knew that it might be a noisy environment. And I knew it was a large company, a large place of employment. And we went with an interpreter one day to meet the employer. And the employer said, oh, I don't think I'd like to hire a deaf person for safety reasons. And so I asked, well, what safety concerns do you have? And he said, well, it's so noisy in this environment. And I replied, well, what does noise look like? He was a little taken back by that. He thought, well, what do you mean, what does noise look like? I don't know. And being deaf, eventually we went onto the floor and to the place of employment, and the interpreter had to wear protective hearing wear and did tell us that it was very, very loud environment. And they asked me, do you need protective gear? And I said, no, I think I'll be all right. And we went around the work floor and went into the office area. And the employer realized now that, in fact, it would be a benefit to hire deaf individuals. And they ended up hiring another 3 deaf employees. And I know that's true oftentimes, that companies are resistant to hiring deaf employees. But we go in and make presentations to deaf employers, and we help them that often resist that temptation to not hire deaf employees.
That's an amazing story. I want to clarify that if you have VR consumers who graduated when they go for interviews at their prospective places of employment, you'll provide an interpreter for them and give them assistance in learning how to go through interviews as well?
We do pay for those needs for voc rehab clients when they're looking for interviews, when they're scheduling those. Voc rehab will provide assistance for that. And we make the company aware when it comes to hiring a deaf employee that if there's a needed training or job coach that can be provided until the person has met the satisfactory expectations within 90 to 120 days. And that's what the voc rehab policy is. We will pay for those services throughout that time period, and we do so all the time.
Wonderful. Next slide, please. So, we've gotten past the 90 to 100 days. They've had a successful placement, so voc rehab will close their case. The person is working, and then say they get laid off. Since 2008, that has been something that's happened a great deal. Many people getting laid off, and they're coming to vocational rehabilitation. So I'm wondering if you can share with us what post-employment services look like. What can VR do once somebody's case has been closed and then other life circumstances happen to arise, especially as to what's happening in today's environment?
That's a good question. It's always a challenge as well. It depends upon a number of factors with any given company or employer. If there's revamping that's taking place, some new employment, perhaps a new inventory system, they may come to VR and reopen a case with those needs, depending upon the company's needs. And then VR will pay for some of that work training or to learn a new system, let's say. If the company is going to keep that employee on. If another company might be closing down entirely, and that's a different story, that's a different approach. We encourage the client to make contact with voc rehab again and look into different possibilities. If a company is closing, and if their case is closed, then we have to begin a new case and start anew. So it depends based upon what's happening with that person's employment, whether the case has been closed or has not been closed. And it really varies from state to state as well. But we do help with post-employment services. If the company is shutting down, then we have to open up perhaps a different case. Maybe there's another company close by that we can help refer them to. It really varies on an individual basis.
Next slide, please. Now, for the participants, I know this is a slide that's difficult to see, but when you print it and have the PowerPoint in front of you, it'll be easier to discern. But I thought it was important to include this particular slide because the majority of the VR counselors will use these codes for a variety of different VR processes. So if the applicant code is 00, if someone gets a job and their case is closed, that's a 26. I know we have a variety of different codes also. I was just wondering, do all states use these same codes?
Yes. In fact, all the states use these, have a similar concept to these case codes, except for a few states that may have some variation on those status codes. But for example, there might be a status 19, let's say, in my state, where a person is receiving services. That's their status. I don't know whether that is standard from state to state. Some may have the codes listed on the right side of your graph here, but they vary from state to state what they refer to. But those case codes should be shared with consumers, and oftentimes interpreters, when working with rehab counselors, can be made aware of those and get a better understanding of what those case codes are so that the clients can understand those. Our philosophy, our policy is that we do try to make those case codes clear to people. Those case codes can be described in more detail because they're oftentimes based upon the federal legislation, then passed on through the states.
So, they're generally the same in the states, but they may each have something unique to their state with, like in your situation, that status code of 19. But in general, most of those codes would be consistent across the states, so that way interpreters can have an understanding of what those codes mean. They can envision that and help them in their interpretation. Okay.
Right.
Yeah. D, yeah, there was some freezing in your video. Maybe it's just the way the downloading is happening. Could you repeat that again?
When it comes to case codes, there are a number of different meanings for each code. And there are numbers of clients. And we oftentimes will have a limit of, say, 3 months or 4 months or a year that they can rest in any given status. If they're in that status for 4 months, there's a maximum, let's say, time period. Perhaps it may be 2 years. If it's 4 years for college, perhaps it's 5 years, depending on that status, if they're making good progress. And we make sure that all clients understand that. But if interpreters understand these case codes more clearly, then they can interpret them more effectively.
So to clarify, the expectations are that if a person comes to Voc Rehab and they're not college bound, then they would be anticipated to complete the VR process within 2 years and go through the various codes that are in this graph. If then services are needed beyond that, then questions will be asked as to why they need to continue in the process. Am I correct?
That's right. And the reason being is that sometimes it will depend on the student's major. If they decide to major in psychology, let's say, but then they change their major at some point during college, that often takes place. And a few students at NTID will, go sometimes 7 years before they graduate. And why that's the case and why it varies, sometimes it's, based on their mainstreaming experience, their family reasons. I can't always answer for each individual, but that does take place.
But if we have a variety of management tools by using these codes, so the voc rehab supervisors will look at what's being used and see that a client has been in a code for a lengthy amount of time, and they may question as to why that's happening, right?
That's right.
Okay. Yep. All right, next slide, please. I also wanted to let you know that this chart that we just showed you and this one will also be shared with you once the webinar has concluded. This is the Model State Plan, abbreviated as MSP. This document speaks to the services that all deaf people of diverse backgrounds working with voc rehab. And every once in a while, that MSD will be modified.
MSP.
And the MSP will then be looked at, and then that is published. I think the last time it was publicized was 2008, and it was over 100 pages going through descriptions of how services to deaf consumers were provided. Maybe, Dee, you could expound a little bit on what is incorporated into that MSP?
Well, first of all, the Model State Plan is not new. I have a very old one that's been used since 1977. You can see here on the screen. Here's one that I found that was rather old. So until 2008, we've had a variety of those. And now we're up to 100 pages. And now we're focusing not only on deaf individuals but hard of hearing, late deafened individuals, deaf-blind individuals, as well as deaf. And so all of the rehab counselors are learning from these various trainings for these different groups. As you mentioned, the different modes of communication, be it ASL, be it oral dominated communication, a foreign-born deaf person who moves, we're seeing that on the increase as well. And the purpose of this plan is for voc rehab to train counselors to meet the needs of those various individuals, be they late deafened, deaf-blind, communicating in different ways and their various needs. Needs aren't uniform throughout these groups, and the rehab counselors need to understand that. In my model state plan, we have several schedules or charts that rehab counselors can go through to train themselves in.
I'm sorry, Dee, your picture froze for us just a moment. If you could just go back just a little bit, not from the beginning. We got most of what your comment was just then, but just there towards the end, if you could just repeat that piece.
In terms of VR professionals understanding the differences between these groups, those with hearing aids, those without, those who don't sign, those who do, and how to, the technology needs of those various groups, because technology, of course, has changed drastically since 2008 even. And at 2014, we have different technology available when it comes to using iPads. In 2008, nobody was talking about iPads, and now that's all anybody's using any longer. And so when it comes to communication needs, transition needs, technology, and the variety, all of that is documented in the MSP. And like you said, currently, this edition is 120 pages, but we continue operating according to it. And the RSA requires these state plans to be looked at and be updated each year. or I believe perhaps it's every 3 years, what services are being provided to the
I'm sorry, that closed there, just there. You were speaking about the state plans. Your picture did freeze on us just a bit, but you said something about them being updated every 3 years and then given to the RSA, and then what else did you say after that?
So as you can see here, Goal 1, for example, is providing supportive education and rehabilitation to deaf and hard of hearing individuals throughout the area of New England. So we have a scheduled training for that purpose, to learn about how to help individuals develop skills. If it's a new rehab client, how to help train them for job readiness. Awareness, working with an employee and giving them more and better information about hiring and working with individuals. When it comes to job development training, or community rehab professionals. If their company is resistant to hiring a deaf person, how do we overcome that resistance? Better partnering for outcomes when it comes to any number of services. It also addresses legislative needs. So these are different examples of what's incorporated in this plan. And this model state plan has a great deal of information included in it based upon how that state's VR system operates. And the state is responsible for perhaps, and an interpreter should look at each state's plan to determine what their state plan includes, because it could oftentimes have implications for how they work as an interpreter.
I would like to clarify one point. You were saying that the state coordinators have the responsibility to be familiar with the MSP and then share the plan to other counselors as to what services that deaf consumers require, and that's what the SCDs do themselves. Is that right? Is that your point?
Yes, and this is the documentation that I have forwarded, and it was happening each year, but now I believe it's happening every 3 years. So in 2014 through 2017, this is what I believe should be incorporated. VR counselors sign this, and then the SRA will send that on to the federal level and make changes to operation accordingly. I wish that there were a more standard format, but unfortunately it varies state to state.
Okay, next slide. Okay. We have some other training opportunities we want you all to be aware of. The first one on the right, PepNet, I apologize, that's already closed. That is no longer an opportunity. It's full. But the opportunities listed on the left for different courses available for interpreters and deaf professionals, the coursework is offered through the Marie Center, which is incorporated into the University of Northern Colorado. The registration is still open until June the 18th. So I encourage you all to go to the Marie Center website, look there to get further information. The next webinar, as part of this 10 webinars presented, will be held on May the 19th at 7 o'clock in the evening. The topic will be expertise, knowledge, and characteristics of voc rehab interpreters. The presenter will be Dr. Glenn Anderson. Next slide. All right. Now is our opportunity to give this to the participants for any questions you might have. Please type them in. I see that there have been a number already posed. Carrie is going to look through those questions and choose some. She will then read them, and the interpreters will be signing them, and then both Dee and I will answer those. We have about 10 minutes for this question and answer period. So, Carrie?
Okay, I had a couple people asking about what education that VR will pay for. They wanted to know if VR will pay for master's programs as well as doctoral programs.
I'll hand that over to Dee.
Boy, I wish that were easy to answer. I'd love to see voc rehab pay for master's and PhD programs, but most of the time they work on just the completion of a BA degree first. And it depends upon, say a company requires a person to have a master's level degree, otherwise they can't go further along in terms of being promoted. And so they can work with voc rehab, and I have seen some deaf individuals receive their master's and PhD supported by voc rehab services if a company has required that. I know it varies state to state. I know of one person who has gone all the way through law school with voc rehab support, which I think is great. I'm thrilled to see that happen because that becomes a model of a person who was very, very serious in getting all the way through their bachelor's degree, master's degree, and then their law school as well for their Juris Doctorate. So I think it oftentimes can depend upon the major that a person chooses. So it's not an easy question to answer across the board. You would need to dig into your state's VR policies and see what they include.
Okay. Carrie?
Does each state determine the 90 or 120 days for the case closure?
Well, shall I go?
Oh, absolutely. That's you, not me.
Generally speaking, it tends to be 90 days, but they can add 30 days, totaling 120, depending upon a person's needs. In general, it's a 90-day limit in most cases. If there are special circumstances that warrant an extension of 30 days, if the person is a solid worker, let's say, or if a person has become employed, but then changes their mind for some reason, or is not, say, just deaf but has family or life circumstances or some perhaps mental issues, cognitive issues, extending that out to 120 days is warranted. It doesn't mean that that's a hard and fast, you're on your own at 120 days. They can return for voc rehab services and you can open the case again for a brief time, but typically the limitation is 90 days from state to state, but 30 days can be extended depending on circumstances.
Would states which do not have a state tax, such as New Hampshire, be more likely not to have OOS?
No, not necessarily when it comes to OOS. For example, we've been talking about an OOS with our staff of rehab counselors, and oftentimes if there's a dearth of positions that need to be filled, it becomes very difficult and common that will have an effect on us needing to declare an OOS. But we have survived through some of this economic turmoil without having to declare OOS. We've continued to operate our system without needing to have that in the state of New Hampshire. I know in other states, typically, in the April or May timeframe, they have no monies in the budget. And the RSA doesn't like that. They like operation to continue through the end of the fiscal year. And some of those are based on the June 1st or July 1st fiscal year start and close, and they end up having to run according to an OOS just to remain in operation. I don't know if your fiscal year starts July 1st or October 1st. Perhaps not June, I'm sorry. Rather, July 1st and October 1st, interpreter correction.
Do they test and inform consumers of their personal learning styles?
Carrie?
When VR does the
We
testing,
can't hear you any longer, Carrie.
can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
When VR does the testing, do they test and inform consumers of their personal learning styles?
Can you repeat that question? Their what? I'm sorry, what style?
Their learning styles.
Oh, their learning style. And what about that?
When
Well,
VR does their evaluation and testing, will they test for the learning styles and inform the VR clients of their learning styles?
There are different formats for different evaluations. Some of them are read, some of them are written, and it's very interesting. Some of them are just interest assessments. We will show the results of those often and share those with consumers, and oftentimes they'll say, oh, I have a strength in that area. And they'll take that into consideration and realize that they have an interest based upon those evaluations, but we do share the results of those. For example, a deaf person may say, I want to go to college. That's what I really, really want. But their reading skills aren't necessarily where they need to be to go to college. And we never say that you can't go to college, but we'll talk about what they may need to do to achieve that, perhaps through an evaluation, and show them the results of that. And then the person will realize that, in fact, they aren't ready yet to go to college, which may mean that they'll need to do something else, perhaps some training, to meet the expectations for entry into college, for admission to college. And that we see that take place often. So is that clear? That
Yeah.
answer?
Yes. What are the qualifications required to become a VR interpreter?
Well, Trudy, I'd like to talk about this, but I know our time is very brief. I would encourage you to come to our next webinar where we'll talk more in depth about the qualifications needed by an VR interpreter. And you can look at the NCIEC website. And that's where we have the ASL Glossary of a variety of terms where I've mentioned. We are also planning to have the competencies and domains of voc rehab interpreters. That's already been published on that site. So you can look there in depth to see what types of skills voc rehab interpreters need to have. And each state does have different requirements for the hiring of interpreters. Some require interpreters to be certified. Some require just the state certification. So it varies from state to state. But generally speaking, the skills and qualifications necessary for voc rehab interpreters can be found in the domains and competencies document. Dee, did you want to add anything to that?
One thing, when you mentioned interpreters and state requirements for interpreter qualification, the state of New Hampshire, and often most states generally require certification, but in addition, some states require licensure. not only certification, but an additional licensure to work in that setting. So those are two guarantees of qualification. And we in the state of New Hampshire are responsible for monitoring and administering that licensure. That requires both certification, but not only that. In some other states as well, Rhode Island, Vermont, each state varies on their qualification. Some are requiring licensure. I believe there are 30 states, it could be more or less, that are requiring licensure, both certification and licensure.
Okay.
I think we're out of time, but thank you very much, Dee and Trudy, and thank you, Kirk and Darlene, for your interpreting services, and to our captionist, Terry, and especially to the NCIEC for helping fund this webinar. To earn CEUs, Lene put a link in the chat box. If you missed that, I will send out the link tomorrow in an email. And in that satisfaction survey, you will find a link to submit for CEUs or a certificate of participation if you would like. If you're watching this webinar in a group, I sent out an email with an attached sheet, sign-in sheet. That is for groups of people, because I had the software registers everybody who logs in, and I have that. But if you are watching in a group, I need you to use the sign-in sheet. Everyone is encouraged, though, to fill out the survey. So as I send out the survey, if you had a group of people, please forward the survey on. It will take about 60 days for the CEUs to show up on your transcript, so please be patient, especially with the new system. There have been some glitches that may take a little bit longer. I hope you guys all join us for the next webinar next month. The registration will be open tomorrow or the day after, and that will be listed on the Marie website, as well as I will send out an email. If you're not signed up for the NCIEC mailing list, please do so, or send me an email and ask me to send you the link for that, and then you can get on the webinar interest list. And I think that is all. Thank you very much for joining us. We couldn't do this without you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you as well, Carrie. And thank you, Trudy, and both interpreters.
The interpreters,
Appreciate this
yes.
great team. And thanks again, Carrie. This was a great discussion. Everybody have a good night.
Let's get off this. Boy. My balls hurt. Too stilted that I found it hard to get a rhythm, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
She spells domain so slow that I'm
Right.